Hello and welcome to our session today. Today we are reviewing the neurological system. Alright, so we have two major objectives for this lecture. We will be able to list the structures of the nervous system, and this is the brain, the spinal cord, and the peripheral nerves. And then lastly, we'll be able to describe the three major functions of the nervous system. So welcome to the session. So the nervous system can be divided into two major compartments. That is the central nervous system, abbreviated as the CNS, and the peripheral nervous system, abbreviated as the PNS. So these are just majorly the nerves. All right. So the central nervous system is further subdivided into two uh, portions. We have the spinal cord and the brain. So the brain is normally found in the cranium, while the vertebral column houses the spinal cord. Both the vertebral column and the cranium are part of the posterior cavity, right? Guys, a link will be popping up on the different types of body cavities, be it the anterior cavity and the posterior cavity. You can use it to try and review how different organs are spread across the body cavities and which body cavity houses which organ. So we can proceed to the peripheral nervous system, and the peripheral nervous system, you have said it is abbreviated as PNS, and the PNS is further subdivided into autonomic nervous system and somatic nervous system. So while the autonomic nervous system deals with the interactions between the internal organs and the glands, the somatic nervous stimulations deals with the interactions between the sense organs, right, and also the voluntary muscles, specifically the skeletal muscles, right, the skeletal muscles. Guys, I think it will be popping up on the different types of skeletal muscles. Okay, remember we have over 600 skeletal muscles on the human body. So the autonomic nervous system is further subdivided into two smaller compartments, where we have the sympathetic nervous stimulation that deals with the arousing, has the arousing effect, the flight fight mood, while the parasympathetic nervous stimulation has a calming effect, where you are able to eat, sit, eat, and digest food, guys. Somatic nervous stimulation, on the other hand, is divided into sensory and the motor. So the sensory deals with the sense input and the motor deals with the sense output. All in all, this is how we can divide the nervous system anatomically. We shall be reviewing on how the nervous system can also be subdivided based on the different functions that they perform, and this will be reflecting on our second objective. Okay, guys. So we have the first major part. Of course, we have said we are going to look at the brain, spinal cord, and the peripheral nerves. So starting with the brain has different major parts. Okay, we could have the cerebellum, all right, the pineal gland, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the pons, the medulla oblongata, the spinal cord, the cerebrum, along with the different lobes for that case. But majorly, the brain is divided into three major regions. We have the forebrain, commonly referred to as the prosencephalon, and the midbrain, the mesencephalon, and the hindbrain, lastly the hindbrain, which is the rhombencephalon. Looking at the prosencephalon, this one consists of structures such as the cerebellum, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the amygdala, the hippocampus, the basal ganglia. While the midbrain consists of the tenectum, the tegmentum, and the reticular formation. Lastly, the midbrain consists of the MPC, which stands for the cerebellum, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. Each part has a distinct functions that they normally carry out in our body. Like for the cerebrum normally controls the conscious thought, reasoning, memory, and our perception in an individual, while the thalamus is a relay station for sensory information heading to the cerebral cortex for that case. Hypothalamus is very important in endocrine system where it regulates a number of functions like regulating body temperature, the hunger, the thirst, the sleep-wake cycles for that case through the release of the relevant hormones for that case. The amygdala is the controls the emotional responses, the fear processing in an individual, while the hippocampus plays a role in formation of new memories and is very important for the learning purposes. The basal ganglia is responsible for coordinating voluntary movements, regulation of motor control in a human body, while the tenectum it helps in coordination of visual and auditory reflexes. The tegmentum is involved in motor control and sensory function, while reticular formation is important in regulation of the sleep-wake cycles. All right, for that case. All right. So we have the reticular formation and the hypothalamus playing a key role in the sleep-wake cycle of an individual. Medulla oblongata is very important in regulating vital functions in the body, like controlling the heart rate, the heartbeat, the breathing, and the blood pressure for that case. Pons are relay stations for signals between different parts of the brain, and this function it normally carries along with also which part, guys? The thalamus, right? Okay, lastly, we have the cerebellum, which coordinates voluntary movements, posture, and balance. If you can narrow down to the cerebrum, um, cerebrum has several lobes that we have actually need to look at them. The frontal lobe, for example, the parietal lobe, we have the occipital lobe, the temporal lobe, right? So if, for example, the frontal lobe, of course, we know this is the front part of the brain and it's responsible for executive functions like planning, decision making, personality, also motor control for that case. The motor cortex, this is the back of the frontal lobe and it initiates and controls voluntary movements for that case. We have the bronchus area and the wernicke's area. So the bronchus area will be found on the left frontal lobe while the Wernicke's area will be found on the left temporal lobe, guys. So for the Wernicke's area, it's responsible for language comprehension. If you have a problem with this area, you may not be able to comprehend language. You may not be able to do so. But for the bronchus area, you find that people who have problems with this, like expressive aphasia, they'll be able to comprehend the language, but they can't express it. That's why we say a disturbance in this area will lead to expressive aphasia, right? So this area is responsible for speech production and language processing, right? Language processing for that case. We also have other lobes like the parietal lobe. This is found at the back for that case and is responsible for sensory perception for that case. Somatosensory cortex it receives and processes sensory information from the body, while the temporal lobe is responsible for auditory processing for that case. You also need to know of the occipital lobe, which is found at the back of the brain and it's responsible for visual processing, all right, along the visual cortex that we have said it receives and processes visual information. So guys, that's what we can talk about the brain, the different parts of the brain and the distinctive lobes that makes up the cerebrum, right, for your information. From there, we could look at the spinal cord, right? Of course, the spinal cord and the brain, they all make up the central nervous stimulation. So in this case, we have the nerves here, the central nerves here. So we have the C1 to C7, T1 to T12, the A1 to 5, and then 1 to 5, and then the coccygeal, which is 1, all right, for that case. If you try to describe the parts of the spinal cord, We have the gray matter for your case, white matter, and the spinal nerves here. So we can be able to see here the white matter, the gray matter. We have the dorsal median sulcus. This is the space in between there. Then you have the dorsal root, the dorsal nerve root ganglion as a spinal ganglion. And then we can now talk of the dorsal ramus and the ventral ramus for our case. Then you have the ventral root, ventral nerve root. Okay, so of course this is the spinal nerve that you guys talking about. So in terms of just listing those parts, we have the gray matter. This is the central region of the spinal cord, and it contains cell bodies of the neurons. It normally processes the the sensory and motor information. While the white matter is the outer region of the gray matter, and this one contains the myelinated nerve fibers or the axon. It normally forms tracks that will transmit signals up and down the spinal cord for that case. Okay, the spinal nerves will emerge from the spinal cord, and they do carry sensory and motor information between the spinal cord and the body, while the dorsal root is the entry point of the sensory fibers, and it contains sensory, these are the afferent nerve fibers. The ventral root is the exit, it contains motor nerve fibers, while the dorsal horn is the part of the gray matter that will be receiving sensory input. So it will process and relay this sensory information. The ventral is part of the gray that will contain the motor. So it will send the motor commands to muscles and glands, all right, to bring about the desired effect. While the central canal, this is a fluid filled canal that is running through the center. It contains the CSF providing nutrients and cushioning for that case. Okay, so those are the different parts of the spinal cord for that case, right? So that takes us to another function or objective of our lecture, of which we are trying to also divide the nervous system physiologically. Anatomically, we have the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. What about physiologically, functionally? All right. So we could have the peripheral nervous system we had already mentioned, and we know the reason why it's named so. It's because it is beyond the brain and the spinal cord. So the nervous system can be divided based on the basis of its function, and we have three major functions. So we have the sensory part, the motor function, and the integration part, right? Sensory information, this is what the section that will be tasked with receiving information about the environment, okay? And then we now have generating responses to that information, that's what we refer to motor. And lastly, coordinating the two, integration. So that gives us the three major functions of the nervous system, all right? We can start with sensation. This is all about receiving information about the environment. It could be either by like for example the heat from the sun, or even inside the body, like the heat generated by the muscle activity. All this is all about sensations, all right? Sensations. So these sensations are also known as stimuli, and the different sensory receptors are responsible for detecting different stimuli. So we have sensory information which travels along the CNS through the PNS nerves into specific division known as the afferent. That is the sensory branch of the peripheral nervous system. So when information arises from the sensory receptors in the skin, like or the skeletal muscles or the joints, it is normally transmitted to the CNS using somatic sensory neurons. So when this information arises, but if this information is arising from the sensory receptors in the blood vessels or internal organs, it is then transmitted to the CNS using visceral sensory neurons for that case. All right. So from there we can look at now the response about it. All right. The response, the motor response for that case. Remember the other one was sensory. So the nervous system will produce a response in effector organs. The effector could be a muscle or a gland due to sensory stimuli. So the motor branch of the peripheral nervous system will carry signals away from the CNS to the effector organs. So when the effector organ is the skeletal muscle, the neuron carrying the information will be the somatic motor neurons for that case. But when the effector organ is a cardiac or a smooth muscle or a glandular tissue, then the neuron carrying the information will be an autonomic motor neuron. Remember, voluntary responses are governed by somatic motor neurons, and the involuntary responses are governed by autonomic motor neurons for that case. So this gives rise to the third function, which is all about integration between the two, right? So stimuli that is detected by the sensory structures are communicated to the nervous system, where information is now processed. So in the CNS, information from some stimuli is compared with or integrated with information from other stimuli or memories of previous stimuli. So then after this now, a motor neuron is activated to initiate a response from the effector organ. So this process during which you have sensory information being processed and a motor response being generated is what we simply refer to it as integrations. Remember, we have a receptor. Okay, so the stimuli is at this part, then is picked up by the receptor, where we now have the sensory neuron. It takes to the brain, right, for interpretation, right? Then we have the integration, then the effector part here, right, to initiate the response. It could be contraction of this muscle, right? It could be contraction of these muscles, or that will enable lifting up from either burning flame or any injurious stimuli for that case. Okay? Okay guys, from there now we can be able to look at neurons and neuroglial cells, all right? These are cells that do support the nervous system, all right? And of course, naturally, the nervous system is made up of two major cells. It could be the neurons, which are the major cells of the nervous, or the glial or the supportive cells, all right? So the glials are the supportive cells for that case, all right? Okay, so while the neurons, so for the neurons, they could be having several parts. Okay, so we could have several parts of a neuron, which is the basic structural function of the nervous system. Okay, they are specialized cells that do transmit information in the form of electrical and chemical signals. So they are the building blocks for the nervous system, and they will be playing a crucial role in facilitating communication between the different parts of the body. So a fair structure of a neuron will consist of a dendrite, okay, a soma, and we have an axon, we have the myelin sheath, we have the nucleus, we have the swan cell, and we have the nerve endings for that case, all right? Of course, the soma is the main part of the neuron that contains the nucleus and most of the cell's organelle, and its major work is to process and integrate incoming signals from other neurons. Dendrites, we have said these are branching extensions. They are here, guys. You can be able to see the dendrites. Remember the soma, we have just looked at it, the cell body. We are now on the dendrites. So they emanate from the cell body. They receive signals from other neurons or sensory receptors. The greater the number of dendrites, the more information a neuron can receive for that case. Then now we have the axon, all right? So the axon is here. You can be able to see our axon. So our axon, right? And the axon, they are long, slender projections that will extend from the bodies or from the cell body or the soma, and it will carry electrical impulses known as action potentials away from the cell body and towards other neurons, muscles, or even glands. We have the axon here of Hillock, right? The axon of Hillock, the axon here. Okay, so we have those junctions, all right. Right, so you find that this is a region where the axon connects to the cell body and is critical for initiation of action potentials, all right? Besides, we have the myelin sheath, the rods of Ranvier, axon terminals, and the synapse. All right, the myelin sheath in many neurons, you find that the axon will be surrounded by a fatty insulating layer, and that's what we call as the myelin sheath. Myelin sheath is here, guys, right? Myelin sheath is here. You can be able to see. Okay, so this one is formed by specialized glial cells that help speed up the transmission of nerve impulses. If you are going to have issues or the problem with the myelin sheath, then this can result in either multiple sclerosis or the Guillain-Barré syndrome, the ones that you'll be looking at when you'll be discussing the other parts. Next, we have the rods of Ranvier. These are gaps in the myelin sheath along the axon. The action potentials, they jump from one anode to the next, which contributes the rapid conduction of the impulses. All right, so we have the rods of Ranvier. Okay, we have them here. You can be able to see that. Okay, so next we have the axon terminals or the synaptic terminals, which are just small structures found at the end of the axon. They do contain synaptic vesicles, and these vesicles are filled with neurotransmitters, which are normally chemicals that transmit signals to other neurons or muscles. So guys, a link on neurotransmitters will be popping up. You can review to see which one is excitatory, which one is inhibitory, which one carries both function for that case. Lastly, we have a synapse, and this synapse is just a junction between the axon terminal of one neuron and the dendrites or the cell body of another neurons. Okay, it's the site where neurotransmitters that you have mentioned will be released, allowing these signals to be transmitted to another neuron or to the next. Okay, so though neuron shapes do vary greatly, each neuron houses must have a nucleus in the region known in the cell body, that's the soma, from which cellular activities can repair or cell membrane recycling controlled. Also, we have associated with this nucleus, we have neurons also have this rough endoplasmic reticula, which are called Nissil bodies. This can be seen in neurons using a light microscope. So the nucleus, the Nissil bodies, Golgi apparatus together, they will produce many ion channels and pumps that will reside into the cell membrane. So these transmembrane proteins are necessary for neurons to send signals. Okay, so they could be graded signals and action potential. In addition, neurons do consume much ATP, typically, so that makes them to have so many mitochondria, okay, as an adaptation. So we could have the dendrites for that case that you have mentioned, all right, and now we can now classify the neurons based on their shapes, right? Like we could have unipolar cells, right? Unipolar cells, these ones, they have one process that includes both the axon and the dendrite, okay? The unipolar axons, or the bipolar axons, which have two processes, the axons and the dendrites for that case, or multipolar. All right, multipolar, they have more than two processes, the axons and more than two dendrites for that case. From there, we could look at the glial cells. These are supportive cells. Naturally, we have 6 major types of glial cells. 4 of them will be found in the central nervous system, and the other 2 will be found in the peripheral nervous system, right? So you can see for the CNS, we have astrocytes. Okay, we have classified them together with the satellite cells. And then you have oligodendrocytes and the Schwann cells. Then you have the microglia and the ependymal cells, guys. So a link will be popping up on the neuroglia cells. Okay, you can look at the function of each type of supportive cells. Okay, for this case, and which we really need to emphasize for our case, is the creating and circulating of the cerebrospinal fluid, right? Remember, the cerebrospinal fluid is normally produced in the ventricular system, right? That means that you have to try and describe the pathway for the cerebrospinal fluid flow. Naturally, the CSF will be produced and secreted by the choroid plexus of each lateral ventricle. Okay, from the lateral ventricle, the CSF will flow through the intraventricular foramen, If you don't feel like calling it so, you could say foramen of Monro, right? Foramen of Monro, okay? Or the interventricular foramen into the third ventricle, okay? So the choroid plexus of the third ventricle. So we have here the third ventricle. So you find that choroid plexus in the third ventricle again will add more CSF, all right? More CSF. So you have more CSF again. So the CSF flows down the cerebral aqueduct into the fourth ventricle, okay? If you don't call to refer to it as the cerebral aqueduct, you could refer to it as aqueduct of Sylvius, all right? Aqueduct of Sylvius into this fourth ventricle, all right? So CSF now choroid plexus of the fourth ventricle now again will add more CSF, all right, more CSF in the fourth ventricle here, all right, in the fourth ventricle. So CSF will now flow out of these fourth ventricles out through the two lateral apertures and one medial aperture. So we have lateral aperture here. Lateral aperture, these are the foramen of Luscas, right? Lateral aperture. And the medial aperture, this is the foramen of Magendie, okay? Foramen of Magendie, all right? So, now CSF will fill now the subarachnoid space and it will bathe the external brain and the spinal cord, right? The spinal cord. So at the arachnoid villi, so the CSF will be reabsorbed, right? It will be reabsorbed into the venous blood of the dural venous sinuses. Okay, guys, so that's how we can be able to describe the pathway of the CSF flow, okay? Third ventricle to the, okay, lateral ventricle to the third ventricle, okay, to the third ventricle through the interventricular foramen or the foramen of Monro, then into the fourth ventricle through the aqueduct of Sylvia or cerebral aqueduct, and then now from the fourth ventricle into the subarachnoid space where it bathes both the brain and the spinal cord through the foramen of Lusca, that's the lateral apertures, and the one medial aperture, the foramen of Magendie, right, for that case. Okay, so that's what we still need to look at. The myelin sheath is very important because this one normally insulates the neurons. So we have the oligodendrocytes in the CNS and the Schwann cells in the PNS. They do work or do the same job of insulating these neurons. Okay, myelin sheaths are just lipid-rich sheaths that normally surround the axons. So by doing so, it creates a myelin sheath that will facilitate transmission of electrical signals along the axon for that case. Okay? Okay, guys, so we could have now the function of the nervous system, which we had already looked at it partly, but we had said we had classified them into three, where we have the sensory input, that is the neural sensation. So we have specialized structures such as nerve endings or cells that will be detecting stimuli, which could be a touch or a change in temperature or a pain. Then now we have the sensory neurons, that's the afferent. They will be transmitting these signals from the sensory receptors to the central nervous system. So these neurons carry informations about the sensory input. Then you have now the integration. This is neural integration. So we have the sensory neurons that carry signals to the spinal cord or brain depending on the location, and then these cells within the CNS will process and then integrate this information. Then they relay these signals between sensory cells and motor neurons. Okay, so on the motor output, that is the motor response, we have the neurons which are involved, and we have the efferent neurons, where we are going to transmit signals from the CNS to the effectors. Could be the muscles or could be the glands, right? So in terms of muscles, that is in the case of motor response involving movement, you have now the motor neurons which stimulate muscle contraction. But for the glands, in the case of motor response involving secretions We have motor neurons that will be stimulating glandular activity for that case, okay? For that case. For the response, you're saying that the response is the action taken in response to the sensory input. So this can be a reflexive action, such as quickly withdrawing a hand from a hot surface or a more complex movement involving multiple muscles. So the response is generated through coordinated activity of motor neurons and effectors for that case. So we have the neural arc that will really help us to understand. And when I say neural arc, this is simply a specific neural pathway that controls a reflex action. So typically it involves a sensory neuron, interneurons, and a motor, right? So we could have the afferent, right? The inter and the efferent for that case, okay? So reflexes are normally rapid, they are involuntary responses to a stimuli and they help protect the body from potential harm. An example could be a knee-jerk reflex by just tapping the patellar tendon will cause a quick contraction of the quadricep muscles for that case. So guys, we can now look at now the peripheral nervous stimulation on the system, and this is abbreviated as a PNS. Okay, it's a very crucial component of the nervous system, and it works in conjunction with the CNS to facilitate communication between the body and the brain. And it encompasses all neural structures outside the CNS and can be divided into somatic and autonomic nervous system. That is anatomical, the way we had pointed out in our introduction. So starting with the somatic nervous stimulation, the CNS, okay, SNS. So here we have the sensory or the afferent division, and it's part of this the CNS, the SNS that is responsible for conveying information, sensory information from the body's peripheral to the central nervous stimulation. So we have sensory neurons that will be detecting stimuli such as the touch, the temperature, the pain in the skin, as well as the proprioception, that is awareness of the body position from the muscles and joints. Then now we have now the motor division, which is now the efferent division, and this one will carry signals from the central nervous system to the skeletal muscles controlling voluntary movement. So we have motor neurons that will be transmitting signals to the muscles, causing them to contract and bringing about movement. The second division is the autonomic nervous stimulation. So this one is subdivided into two major ones. We have the sympathetic division and parasympathetic division. While the sympathetic division system is often referred to as the flight or flight response, the parasympathetic one is commonly referred to as the rest and digest response. So you find the sympathetic division, it normally prepares the body for intense activity by increasing the heart rate, dilating the pupils, redirecting blood to the vital organs. On the other hand, the parasympathetic division will be promoting activities that occur during rest. It could be digestion, a lower heart rate, and helping the body conserve more energy, right? So we have the parasympathetic and the sympathetic stimulations, right? Okay, guys. So what about the anatomy of the peripheral nerves? So, of course, nerves, these are bundles of nerve fibers and their associated connective tissues, all right? So, nerves in the PNS can be classified into two major ones. We have the cranial nerves, which are just 12 in number, all right? And the spinal nerves. So, cranial nerves do originate from the brain and primarily serve the head and the neck. There are 12 in number, right? And we can have them here. Olfactory, which is associated with the smell, optic, vision, oculomotor, eye movement, and pupil reflex. And trochlea, the eye movements, trigeminal, involved in face sensations and chewing. The facial is involved in face movement and taste. while the glossopharyngeal is concerned with throat sensation, taste, and swallowing. Accessories involving the neck movements, hypoglossal, the tongue movements, the vagus is involving movement, sensation, and abdominal organs. Okay, it's also referred as the wandering nerve for that case. Vestibulocochlear is responsible for hearing and balance, and abducing is for the eye movement. All right. So we have 12 cranial nerves. We have some are sensory, others are motor, and also some could be having both sensory and motor for that case. And each has a responsibility to play for that case. Okay. We could have a mnemonic where we are able to tell which one is sensory, which one is motor, where we normally say that some say marry money, but my brother says big brain matter more. So this mnemonic normally helps remember which cranial nerves are purely sensory, that's olfactory, optic, and vestibulocochlear, which one are purely motor, that are the trochlear, abducing, hypoglossal, and which one are mixed, like the oculomotor, the facial, the glossopharyngeal, vagus, and accessory for that case, right? So that should be able to help us understand all the 12 cranial nerves, okay? We shall be sharing on a lecture on how to assess all these nerves, all right? But at this time, let's finalize the lecture by looking at the spinal nerves. So these spinal nerves normally emerge from the spinal cord and are named based on their location along the vertebral column. So we could have the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal. Remember, they are 31 in total for that case, okay? And we can have them here, right? So these 31 nerves, we could have one C1 to 8, right? Where we have the cat, store, lick, some cool coffee. Okay, this should at least help us remember that. Okay, so there are some distinction that we really need to understand. Like the C5 normally controls the elbow flexors, C6 wrist, C7 elbow, 8 finger flexion, T1 finger abductors, L2 hip flexors, L3 knee extensors, ankle dorsiflexors are L4, L5 grade to toe extension, and ankle plantar flexions. This is S1 that's involved, right? The last concept in this lecture is about the ganglia. These are just clusters of nerve cells that are normally located outside the CNS. They are part of the peripheral nervous system and they serve several functions, including relaying sensory information or coordinating motor functions. Okay, so ganglia are found along the parts of the peripheral nerves and they play a crucial role in processing and transmitting signals for that case. Okay. So we could have sensory ganglia or autonomic ganglia. So the autonomic ganglia are found in the parts of the autonomic nervous system, while the sensory is located near the spinal cord or along the peripheral nerves. Okay? Okay, guys, so that marks the end of this first part about the anatomy of the nervous system. Okay, so guys, let's look at now the neurological disorders. Thank you.